Hi, this is the ContinuuMini, a new portable synthesizer and smaller brother to one of the most unique instruments I've ever played, the Continuum from Haken Audio. There are two things that make the Continuums special: their extremely sensitive playing surface and the advanced built-in synth engine called the EaganMatrix, along with its custom built-in presets. I reviewed the bigger Continuum earlier this year, link in the description, and I really liked it, but as I mentioned in that video, I wished that it cost less and that it had more onboard controls, and the Mini is certainly a step in that direction. In this video, I'll explore the Mini in depth and compare it to its bigger brother and talk about some pros and cons, so let's get started. The first question that I think needs to be answered is, what's the point of this type of instrument? Why does it exist and what's special about it? Now, it's in a category called expressive instruments, but I don't like that term so much because it's not like you can't get an expressive and moving performance out of a regular keyboard, so what are the differences? Normal keyboard-based controllers are designed primarily as on-off switches with initial velocity detection. Once a note is triggered, its pitch is set and its velocity is set, and it's left to do its own thing depending on how it was pre-programmed, and you as a player are typically no longer part of the sound. Now, modern controllers have aftertouch, a pitch bend, and mod wheel, but those are add-ons rather than an organic part of how you play a note. In this demo, the key step is hooked up via MIDI to the ContinuuMini, so you're hearing the same sound engine, but now I'll play it with the different interface, obviously. In the ContinuuMini, velocity isn't a one-time calculated thing, but rather an organic part of how you play a note. In synth terms, for example, the blowing on the pipe in this instrument isn't a one-time attack decay sustain release thing, but rather something that I control with my finger. I can approach it quickly, or bring it in gradually. Now, some keyboards have aftertouch, but the way most keyboards are designed, aftertouch has a relatively narrow, hard range of motion and is hard to control precisely, whereas here, it's designed to be controlled very smoothly with a pretty large range of motion. So that's control in the Z dimension, or pressure. Same goes for pitch bend. Applying vibrato here, or slides, is a very natural thing, whereas here, it's possible, but not really the intended use of the controller. You can also play two notes on the ContinuuMini, and perform two slides in opposite directions. While targeting specific notes. Finally, if a synth preset is programmed that way, the mod wheel can change its timbre. The Mini has a sort of little mini mod wheel built into the surface itself. As you rock the surface back and forth, you can create quite drastic changes in timbre, obviously based on how the preset is programmed. Or this preset, for example. Now, all these, of course, work in tandem: pitch bend, pressure, and timbre. Now, that said, unlike the X-axis for pitch control or the Z-axis for pressure, due to the narrow form of the Mini, this back and forth rocking motion is the hardest to control precisely, so expect to practice it if you want to master it. Okay, moving on. The dynamic, expressive physical control surface and motion detection is only half the story. While you can use the ContinuuMini to control external hardware or software synths, and I'll show that in a bit, what really makes it special in my opinion is the built-in synth engine with hundreds of presets tailored to make the most of what the controller has to offer. The programming of both this engine, the EaganMatrix, and the presets that come with the Mini is simply top-notch. The Mini comes with hundreds of built-in presets in 15 different groups, 11 sound groups organized by category, and 4 utility groups. You can flip through them using these preset buttons. And if you hit both octave buttons, you enter the menu system, and then you can just change banks using the preset up and down buttons. And like I said, there are 15 different groups and over 300 presets built in here. Now, the Mini doesn't require a computer or iPad to work, but if you have one connected, you can see the actual preset names on screen rather than just numbers, as well as control different preset macros and parameters. More on that in a bit as well. Now, while the Surface can detect only 1 or 2 touch points at a time, the internal synth engine has 8 voice polyphony. So you can play additional notes either with an external keyboard or sequencer, or with the help of an external pedal, as I'll show you in a bit. So for example, I could play a chord here, and still solo on top of it. The Mini also knows how to receive polyphonic aftertouch from a keyboard that supports it. But I think you can see the stepping here obviously isn't as good as the Mini, but you can, if you want to, use external polyphonic aftertouch on the Mini's synth engine. And you could do this while playing the Mini as well. Some sounds may lend themselves better to external control. So if you have a keyboard with polyphonic aftertouch, you can use it to control the Mini's synth engine. Let's look at a slightly different setup. This is a completely portable setup. The Mini is powered by this little power brick here. The iPad has a camera connection kit running into a USB to MIDI adapter into this USB MIDI host, which is driving power and MIDI into the Mini. You have access to the preset categories here, and you can choose the individual presets here. Each preset has up to 4 custom barrels based on how the preset is defined. So you can play with these to change the preset characteristics. Aside from the over 300 built-in presets, there are 16 user presets, and you can back these up to a computer and bring in other groups. Another noteworthy control you have is the degree of rounding. So the ContinuuMini, as its name implies, is obviously a continuous surface. Now, while you can perfect your craft and, like a violinist, find the exact right place for each note, you can apply rounding to make things easier. And you also have control over the initial rounding if you like. So with initial rounding on, you'll always hit a note. And if you turn it off, it will literally behave as a continuous surface. Same for rounding. If you take it to the extreme, you'll lose the fun of pitch bends, so you always want it at least around here, let's say, for smooth pitch bends. Alongside the way a preset is built, the ContinuuMini also has an effects engine, which contains a reverb, delay, or echo, so you can apply various effects. To your sounds. I'll check out a few more of these, but obviously there's a lot of exploration to be done here. Now, aside from using a computer, iPad, or configurable MIDI controller of choice to control these sound parameters, you have access to quite a few of them using the menu system. Let's go through this briefly. Other than changing the preset banks, you have access to 3 audio dim levels, to gain control, and you can see the corresponding action on screen as well. You can control both the ongoing rounding rate and the initial rounding rate. You have access to the 4 barrels or macros, B1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can control the effect level and the effect time. Now, this gives you access to these parameters, but I highly recommend thinking of pairing this, like I said before, either with an iPad, a computer, or a MIDI controller. Other configuration options are what the pedal is routed to. We'll talk about that in a second. You can define the behavior of the pedal extension port to speak with Haken's CV modules. And I think that's it. Control the screen brightness as well. Right, so those are the things you can configure using the menu. Aside from tweaking preset parameters, you can also program your own presets using the EaganMatrix. I already included an introductory tutorial to it in my review of the big Continuum, and I'll include a link to that below. But in one sentence, the thing that differentiates it from regular synths is the way that it's built. It invites you to modulate any one of the many available synth engines and parameters as a function of the X, Y, and Z motion sensors, which means the sounds you create can be extremely dynamic and varied over time based on how you play. The synth engine is DSP-based and has a massive number of synthesis engines, including subtractive, FM, physical modeling, and more. It's an 8-voice synth engine, so even though you can only input 1 or 2 pitches at a time using this playing surface, you can have a lot more going on using an external keyboard or an external pedal, which I'll show you in a bit. Let's talk about the build a bit. The Mini is extremely light. It weighs around 350 grams or less than 13 ounces, so for comparison, that's like less than the weight of 2 average cell phones. This little sticker is removable and has a basic description of what's going on, but there's quite an extensive quick reference guide printed on the back. Now, despite being light, physically the Mini is built like a tank. The entire enclosure is rather thick aluminum. You play on a continuous nylon-covered aluminum plate that sits on 2 piano wire springs and responds to every light touch, yet doesn't play when you rest your fingers on it. It does take a little bit of getting used to the fact that this is one plate across the instrument. On the left side, there's a mini USB port for MIDI and power, and how great it is that they didn't choose micro USB. This feels much sturdier. There's an expression pedal input, which can also be used as a digital connector to 2 control voltage modules available separately and potentially other things in the future. And there's a headphone port for audio output. So up until now, everything is fantastic. The Mini has the same sound engine as the bigger Continuum. It costs less and can be powered by a little power brick. But with that said, there are 2 big differences between the Mini and the bigger Continuum other than 2 octaves instead of 4 or 8 on the bigger ones. The first difference is that the Mini's control surface supports either single touch or limited duotactic action. So what does that mean? While the sound engine is 8-voice polyphonic, the surface itself can only detect full 3D motion on 1 note at a time. It can do it for 2 notes at a time as long as they share the same Y and Z axis expression, meaning that the amount of pressure and roll is shared between the 2 notes. Now this can be viewed either as a limitation or a cool playing tool depending on what you're trying to achieve creatively. For example, trills. But ultimately it's much less than the fully independent multiple touch point support on the bigger Continuums. The second big difference between this and the bigger Continuums is obviously the height or size of the Y-axis area. You won't be able to easily use your thumbs on this, so it's really sort of like a 4-finger playing thing. Now that's not that much of an issue because the surface really only detects 1 or 2 touch points, as we talked about before. It's mainly only a Y-axis motion issue, which takes some time to get used to here. Not that much of an issue, but also a noteworthy difference is that the surface of the bigger Continuum is also quite different. It's made of neoprene and is soft and spongy, whereas the Mini's surface is red nylon on much thinner neoprene covering a hard aluminum plate. Finally, another way of getting more than 1 or 2 notes out of the Mini, as well as adding another layer of expression, is connecting an expression pedal or on-off foot switch to it. You can assign a pedal to any one of a number of destinations. For example, assigning it to sustain will let me add notes 1 by 1. Sostenuto is a nice variation on sustain that will let me, for example, hold a note as a drone and then play on top of it. And if you hook up an expression pedal to it rather than an on-off foot switch, you can also control the level of sustain or sostenuto, or any one of the barrels or any number of other destinations. The ContinuuMini also has a bunch of software and hardware instrument presets. Works nicely with Equator, Rolly's synth, some presets work nicely, but for good y-axis control, the response curves need to be tweaked a little bit. The ContinuuMini also has a control preset for Omnisphere. If your synth isn't one of those that has a built-in preset, it's quite easy to create your own. Just make sure to match up the pitch bend range, the y-axis CC, and the z-axis CCs. Okay, so let's look at some pros and cons. On the pros side, the Mini has the same excellent synth engine and fantastic presets as the bigger Continuum. The ContinuuMini is super light and doesn't require anything else to work. There's no need to pair it with an iPad, computer, or a MIDI controller, but that said, like I mentioned before, you'll definitely get more mileage out of it if you do so. The controls on the X and Z axis are excellent. It succeeds at making you feel at one with the sounds you're making, just like the bigger Continuum. The Y axis isn't as usable as the bigger Continuum, but can still provide pleasant surprises as you wiggle your finger around, obviously based on how it's configured in the particular preset. A both pro and con is the EaganMatrix. It has the most comprehensive and powerful mod matrix I've ever seen, but as is usually the case with powerful synths, expect quite a learning curve if you want to make the most of it. On the cons side are the limitations that I mentioned earlier, the y-axis control, and the fact that you can only play 1 or 2 notes at a time. So in summary, as I said in the beginning of this video, the Continuum is one of my favorite instruments, and the ContinuuMini brings a lot of that magic into a smaller, more portable form factor and is substantially less expensive. It's a joy to use, and the fact that it has a built-in synth engine means that it can complement any setup in a hassle-free way with both expression and unique sounds that are very different from what you can expect from a regular synth, whether it's analog or digital, because of the way that you interact with the sounds. I've added the ContinuuMini to the Expressive Instrument Buyer's Guide in my constantly updated book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available on Patreon. Check that out if you want to learn more and support the work done on this channel. If you have any questions about the Mini, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. Hit like if this review was useful, and subscribe and turn on notifications if you don't want to miss any future videos. Thanks very much for watching.